Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I know there's still people filtering in, but we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're watching from today. I know our audience tends to span the globe, and so we welcome everyone. I am Jenny Town. I'm a senior fellow here at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and director of 38 North and the former director of our Korea program, which is, of course, what the program that is hosting today's meeting. We really wanted to talk today about the impact of artificial intelligence tools on misinformation and disinformation. And certainly AI has become the fixation of the policy community these days, and rightly so, for the transformative effect it's having across multiple domains, being integrated into work processes, military systems, and even our everyday decision-making. But progress does also come with costs. And I think we're still trying to figure out how to balance innovation and regulation. In the information space, of course, while various forms of AI have enabled the rapid generation of text, voice, and images that can be used to entertain or even facilitate better cross-cultural communication, it can also be exploited by bad actors to deceive, mislead, and manipulate social narratives in ways that can influence the public and policies, as well as spill over into offline violence, harassment, or worse. So today's event, we will discuss the findings of a year-long study we've been doing here, looking at this idea of AI-enabled misinformation and disinformation and how we can work together, especially amongst allies, to try and counter these trends. This is really, in doing so, we looked at how states, especially the US and South Korea, could and should enhance cooperation to try and mitigate this situation, knowing that this is part of a new reality that both knows no boundaries and is only going to get worse. And especially as we're seeing in the discourse today about the state of play in the Middle East, where we're being flooded with information, some real but misrepresented, some AI generated, to support a certain narrative about one side or the other. So how can we decipher fact from disinformation? What kind of cooperation is needed to better regulate, educate, and counter these kinds of disinformation campaigns? We have published 4 papers already on various aspects of this project so far. And our final paper will go live next week. And so we'd like to thank the Korea Foundation for their generous support of this research. And with that, we're eager to dive into the discussion. And so we have 4 amazing experts with us today to help us talk through some of these issues and different aspects of them. Dr. Jian Shin is the Associate Professor at the Department of Media Production, Management, and Technology at the University of Florida. She teaches and researches social media dynamics with a focus on the spread of misinformation and fact-checking. She's widely published in academic journals and has co-authored 2 books examining how technology has transformed society. Helen Lee is the Director of Intelligent Cyber Research and a Senior Engagement Manager at Cyber Risk at NextPeak. As the Director of ICR, she leads the company's geopolitical risk offerings and engagements, and oversees research on cybersecurity risks, AI, national cyber strategy, and more. Nathan Beauchamp Mustafaga is a senior policy researcher at RAND and a professor of policy analysis at the RAND School of Public Policy. His focus is on Asian security issues, and his research interests include Chinese foreign policy, Chinese military strategy, Chinese influence operations, Chinese nuclear strategy, Chinese deterrent signaling, and the Korean Peninsula, and the Indo-PACOM posture. And last but of course not least, Michael Barnhart, who we lovingly call Barney, is an insider intelligence and investigations for DTEX. He, with nearly 2 decades of experience in intelligence and cybersecurity, Barney has built a career at the intersection of national security and cyber operations. And his expertise spans human, SIGINT, and counterintelligence, with a particular focus, especially these days, on North Korean cyber activities and IT workers. So we're going to start with a bit of discussion amongst the panelists and myself. For our audience, please feel free, of course, to pose questions at any time in the Q&A box, and we'll work them into the latter half of our time on today's webinar. And so with that, I'd like to start with Jian. And for Jian, the paper that you wrote, if we pull out some of the key themes of it, certainly misinformation and disinformation campaigns are not new. But how are different AI tools now transforming or weaponizing this space?
Well, Jenny, thank you for a kind introduction and for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. Well, historically, technology and disinformation have often gone hand in hand. So from printing press to social media, this technological advances has made it much easier to spread misinformation and disinformation. But now with AI, what we are seeing today is fundamentally different. AI represents a huge shift from amplifying distribution to production. Now we are producing fake information and false information much easily and to a large audience. I believe as a result, we are living in an ecosystem where we cannot easily trust what we are seeing is true or false, and that leads to trust deficit. As a society, we grow susceptible to misinformation and manipulation by bad actors. And it has a consequences for not only political outcomes, but also public discourse and social trust. So there's a lot to be discussed, but I'm looking forward to hearing from other people on this panel and learn more.
Thanks, Jian. If we could move quickly to Helen, actually. And we know that we sort of laid out the contours of the problem, and we can get into it a little bit more as we go along. But certainly there have been efforts to try and regulate AI, especially in the information space, well, especially AI writ large, as more and more AI processes and tools are being integrated into the work that we do these days. And in Korea, of course, has been at the forefront of this, of the regulation side of it. I know you've done a lot of research into especially Korea's new AI Basic Act. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about how this came about, and what it seems to get right, and what are some of the challenges that they're finding in the implementation of it.
Yeah, so the Korea AI Basic Act is a result of 4 years of discussion across different presidencies and 19 different bills merging together. And one of the things that it highlights is it creates a lot of new centers and bodies to help regulate and research AI risk and AI usage, which I think is the right step in the correct direction. The intent behind the final product, which was passed at the end of 2024, was first to continue boosting national competitiveness so that South Korea stays at the forefront of AI innovation, but at the same time to tackle AI-related society issues. And some places say like to maintain human dignity in the face of AI risk. That second piece is less about like cybersecurity and AI malicious use as much as about some of the other societal issues that came about around the time that the law was being formed together. So that includes disinformation and deepfakes. And of course, focusing on those aspects seems like the correct focus for where South Korea's misinformation, disinformation environment is. The law was passed in 2024, but was supposed to start going into effect earlier this year in January. And I think in coming towards implementation, some of the weaknesses and gaps were highlighted. First, because the act was a broader, higher arching regulation. It did call for more intermediary steps, new bodies, lower level regulations be created within that year or so of time between passing and implementation, and some of those deadlines and creations that were not met. Some of the things that were more clarified towards as we got closer to January 2026 were like, what is a high performance AI model, which is a question that everyone had, except the description and explanation confused people even more because the description was super technical and not really focused on the impacts or safety aspects that other AI experts typically focus on. The law also added on more disclosure requirements for labeling AI generated products, and the labeling requirements kind of changed depending on what kind of content we're talking about, which led to a different criticism or potential gap, which is the compliance requirements are uniform across South Korea. So there's no, it doesn't change depending on the size of the organization, and the burden for startups has been flagged as a potential weakness.
Can you talk a little bit more about what some of the responses to the AI law have been, especially from industry? Is it enough? Do they find it restrictive? What are some of the criticisms of the law, as well as some of the things that, again, that seem to be going well?
Yeah, I think just in general across countries, AI regulation, typically the industry's first reaction is it's too restricting. You're gonna hamper innovation. You're making our country lose its national competitiveness. But I think in the case of South Korea specifically, a lot of startups are their reactions are that the compliance is too strict and too high, a requirement that it's going to impact the small and medium-sized businesses. There's also a lot of industry and legal backlash on the lack of clarity on some of these definitions, such as the high performance system that I previously mentioned. There's also timeline criticisms from the industry. The EU passed their AI Act before Korea did, but they had a longer implementation timeline that spanned years and kind of a phased implementation. South Korea decided to go all in at the beginning of 2026 and said that it'll be okay because within 2025, they'll build all these smaller bodies and lower level regulation, which didn't happen. So now what they did instead of listening to the industry, which was let's delay implementation, was they decided to give the act is implemented as of January, but they're going to give everyone until 2027 before penalties are enforced. And then, of course, you have the other side of the I guess, spectrum organizations backlashing that if you don't have enforcement mechanisms and penalties on this regulation, then what is the point of having it in the first place?
All good questions, of course. Jian, I wonder if we could come back to you real quick. I know that you've looked at some of the other AI regulations that exist today, such as the European EU AI Act, as well as some of the initiatives that are going on here in the United States. And can you talk a little bit about how they compare to, what South Korea has been doing? And again, what are some of the criticisms and some of the challenges of finding this balance of regulation and innovation?
Well, I'm not a legal scholar. I will put it out there transparently. So my understanding of the regulation with deepfakes and AI-generated images is that there's multiple layers in terms of protecting consumers and public interest. That is, at the platform level, they have to prioritize their engagement metrics, but at the same time, at the social level, we are putting a pressure, and then there's a government level. And at least in the US, we are advancing, protecting politicians and voters, at least regulating AI-generated fake content from distributing 30 days before the election time. But in other areas such as pornographic or Sora 2, when it reproduced dead celebrities and into the content market, that's an area where it lacks a lot of regulation, and there's a gap between what consumers think and what the platforms can decide. So we need a high guardrails. And EU and South Korea, they're developing too and integrating all these different areas, not only political realm, but still, I think there are so many disconnected parts that need to come together.
And certainly, as with the Take It Down Act here in the United States, if there is AI generated explicit content online, if it's reported, it can be taken down. But the lag time really matters because, of course, it can spread so quickly, and the regulations and even the platforms and the reporting process can take so long that the damage can already be done before any kind of action takes place. Which is, a new reality again that, the legislation will always have to try and keep up with. And there's big questions about where the accountability does lie in terms of the companies, the platforms themselves, versus the regulations and the regulators. I want to talk a little bit, if we can move into sort of the other side of this space. Of course, when we're talking about this pollution of disinformation and misinformation, especially on social media. So to the point that, it's hard to trust anything that we see anymore. And we hear this a lot of, like anytime you get a video, whether it's good or bad or controversial or not controversial, the first question is it real? And if we've gotten to the point where we have such disassociation and such disenfranchisement in this, it does create a lot of vulnerability, both in terms of social cohesion and the way that, it can fuel a lot of the division that already exists and the polarization that already exists. But it also creates, those are the kind of vulnerabilities that can also be exploited by bad actors and adversarial actors. So I wonder, Nathan, if we could turn to you next and talk a little bit more about, of course, China. And especially when we think about adversarial information operations in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, amongst our partners, that does have spillover effects for the United States as well, China comes top of mind. In the paper that you wrote for our series, you've written about China's targeted efforts towards South Korea in particular. And can you talk a little bit more about why China focuses on South Korea so much and what the aims, first of all, of their information operations have been?
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. So I think, China's interest in shaping South Korea's information environment probably flow just from its broader kind of perception of South Korea's importance in the region, right? So South Korea is a major economic and security player in the region. It has a, strong alliance with the United States, also increasing cooperation with Japan. So all of these things make South Korea an important actor in the region. That makes it an important neighbor for China to both maintain relationships with, but also seek to influence South Korea's information environment. Talking about the goals, there are probably several goals for Chinese efforts. One of them is just to shape public opinion. Two is to shape elite opinion. Three would be to shape, South Korean policies and politics in a way that is favorable to China. And then fourth, going back to the alliance, I was looking specifically in this paper at Chinese military thinking on the topic. And it's very clear the Chinese military recognizes the value, the importance of alliances, specifically US alliances in the region. And so any opportunity for China to degrade or weaken split alliances, whether with US-Japan or US-South Korea or US relations with the Philippines or relations with Taiwan, any opportunities, China wants to take advantage of those. And so, information operations is another way that China can seek to do that.
And in your paper, you talk a lot about when we're talking about how AI is aiding these operations. You talk a lot about especially large language models and how they're shaping the capabilities and transforming the capabilities that China has in order to be persuasive in these campaigns. Can you why is this such an important tool for Chinese information operations, especially in the South Korean context?
Sure. So what I like to say, thinking about Chinese information operations, especially online, is, there are two parts here that have come together. We've already been talking about a little bit, right? That social media gave China, and really any malign actor, domestic or foreign, social media gave them the ability to do targeted information operations, really easily to actually speak or release channel content directly to the folks you want to talk to. And then AI is given the ability to do tailored information operations at scale. So if you read Chinese military writings, what they complain about, what they acknowledge their own weaknesses, they're bad at foreign languages and they're bad at cross-cultural communication. Well, AI turns out is pretty good at both translating and understanding context, right? And so it helps bridge that gap for you without having to actually, train somebody in Korean or have them live in South Korea and understand that local cultural and societal context. It really helps bridge the gap. It's certainly not perfect, but it gets you, from a 20% solution to a 70% solution pretty easily, right? The other aspect I would flag is that because of this, scalability at, for moderate to high quality for low cost, it really actually lowers the bar for which countries any kind of influence operations enterprise can target, right? So historically, I would argue that China's probably been most focused on Taiwan and then maybe the United States for its information operations. But the ability to use AI and really, generate at scale, moderate to maybe even higher quality content means that it can target a lot more countries with the same amount of people. And so South Korea probably falls into a second tier for targets that historically have been perhaps underserved within the Chinese influence effort. But now that AI gives, one or, a smaller team of people the opportunity to use AI, it means that China may be increasing its influence efforts against South Korea because it's so much easier to do that.
And can you give an example of where we've seen this in practice and where we have evidence it was Chinese influence in campaigns in South Korea?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll two things. One, South Korean government has started to release more information of where they've attributed, uh, for example, fake news websites that were masquerading as local Korean news and media organizations. They've attributed those back to Chinese public relations firms. Then I don't think they've specifically attributed it back to the Chinese government, but it's certainly coming from China-based organizations and actors, and that raises questions about Chinese government involvement. Second, Microsoft over the last 2 years, they have a large monitoring team, have been reporting that China has been targeting South Korea on a variety of issues, including trying to wedge South Korea-Japan relations at key points in time, and maybe also trying to influence South Korea's elections in some ways. So we have, at least some reporting that there is evidence of Chinese both intent and then actual efforts to influence South Korean kind of information environment.
And certainly, if they can do that for China, they can do that for other countries as well, and other countries of their target. We do have a question, and Barney, I'm going to come to you next, just to define the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Of course, misinformation is when the information, for instance, is false, but the person who is spreading it doesn't know that it's false. It's unintentional. Versus disinformation is when the information is false and the person spreading it knows that it's false and it's an intentional spread of false information. And so these different dynamics will come from different actors, but there's a lot of misinformation out there that's very easily spread. And if we're talking about more of these adversarial efforts that tend to be more disinformation in order to sway public opinion in one way or another. Of course, if we're talking about bad actors, and in the Korea context, North Korea is, of course, of great concern. And I think oftentimes we think about North Korea as, not being as technologically advanced as other countries. What kind of AI do they have? But we do know that, for instance, North Korea has become adept at cyber crimes and cyber attacks. Their remote IT workers are competitive in the field and, of course, infiltrating a number of different Fortune 500 companies across numerous industries. And so, Barney, what do we understand North Korea's access and use of AI to be these days?
Thanks for having me too, by the way. I'm going to share a picture real quick. So Microsoft actually just put out an AI thing that Sungju Park actually he's a North Korean researcher, and he had it's funny, he used AI to talk about the AI thing there. I think you can kind of see how the North Koreans are using some. Is that a little too small, Jenny? I don't know if I might just kill this.
It's a little small, but keep going,
Okay.
keep talking.
Well, I'll just talk about it. Basically, I'll just kind of read off of it. But basically, when you think of North Korea, you got to still kind of keep in that same mind frame that a lot of what they have going on is they're more of a criminal syndicate versus a kind of a more of a legitimate government, and they really kind of keep that criminal lifestyle all the way through really different parts of society, but their entire government really structured that way from a more of a criminal enterprise standpoint. So when you think of criminals, you think of them adopting technology before really the rest of the world has, versus not to mention how many defenders have to catch up to that. So whenever you think of them, I mean, we talk about AI now, and we've been talking about it for the past few years, but in regards to how they've been using it, we've seen them in the invention of AI, and how even when it was becoming more mainstream, they were hopping onto it a lot quicker than everybody else. So when ChatGPT was just coming out, there were malicious versions of it. We saw Worm GPT. It was a malicious ChatGPT that was just made to essentially create, malicious payloads and do all the bad things that AI was doing. And that's super interesting just for how long that was, 4 years ago we saw that happening. And, a lot of the AI adoption we have now is still kind of catching on, whereas they were gravitating to it so early on. And it's interesting to see because it's like the different levels of it. So you have IT workers, which are going to be on the malicious cyber actors. They're on the lower side of it because they're more revenue generation, and they're using it for things like resumes, helping build their resumes, helping with the interview techniques. And they don't quite have the same access to the internet that the rest of the guys do, like your heavier cyber operators and your hacking units. So you kind of see them using it different ways. So the lower level guys are using it just almost as an AI assistant to help them get work and help them do more work writ large, just kind of really at a scale. Whereas some of the higher the echelon, some of the more the crypto focused ones are actually out searching vulnerabilities, helping finding malicious payloads, doing things and doing it more, doing deep fakes, talking about misinformation and disinformation. We have the North Koreans doing deep fakes on crypto CEOs and convincing some of their own employees, and actually transferring funds out that way. That's something you might not see on the IT worker side of the house, but in terms of the access, we see it ChatGPT, Copilot, DeepSeek. Again, everything with that self-reliance model that North Korea has really baked in there. They want to do it internally, so you see them building their own models internally, so they don't have to deal with the DeepSeeks and the Western entities making their own AI models. But just the level of how they're doing it, and the APT actors having a lot more access. But in terms of which ones they use and which ones they don't, they're being used across the board. And I did scan the attendee list. I think a lot of people on this call actually have been subjected to North Korean AI usage in some way, shape, or form, because one of the groups that I think we all know and love, APT-43, Kim Suki, I saw them using Worm GPT to create malicious payloads that I know hit two people on this call. So it does directly affect us in ways, but they always find a way to get it done.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we've definitely all been victims of APT-43, anyone who works in the Korea space or adjacent to the Korea space.
Yeah, we've seen them.
And the North Koreans, of course, have gotten really better at cross-cultural communication, and especially professional language, to be able to propose asking questions as a reporter, asking questions as a researcher, as a way to try and get us to respond to them. Um, the kind of information operations, though, that we've seen in sort of the Chinese case towards the Koreans, Barney, do we see that happening from the North Korean side, especially towards South Korea? And if not, then what are, some of the models what are they learning from the field?
Yeah, and this is an interesting one because there's a lack of visibility right here in this specific area because so we have to make general assessments and kind of educated guesses on where they're going based on essentially where we know they've been. So this is whenever we think of AI in North Korea, even from I learned a lot from the Simpson Center on this, specifically you guys' reporting, but it all first started off with automation, trying to get the agricultural efforts going up, and then over time they're using that automation and AI, and then doing it into military things. And then we're seeing AI being used in cyber operations, and we're seeing AI being used in weapons manufacturing, as we saw with the AI assisted suicide drones. So even though we know it's a society or a government really that's built on propaganda, a lot of the propaganda is built inwards for their own people, and a lot of times we don't have that lack of visibility just based on placement and access for where we're at, and they're not integrated with the world as we all know. So we don't have that visibility inwards. But if we know that this is a country that one loves their AI, we see them using it at scale, we see them using it in every facet of what they're doing operationally, but we don't have that visibility, but we know that they love propaganda. We have to assume that this AI and the generated images, the LLMs, it's all going to be directed internally. If we can get some evidence back on that, we can kind of shape what we're dealing with here. But I think it would be short-sighted for us to not assume that they are not using AI to help with the propaganda efforts, just because they master those markets so well on their own internal people. I can kind of assess that if you're really working on your propaganda efforts internally, especially using AI, then it's almost like a training ground that what you might be able to see for them to do externally. Okay, this worked here, we perfected this, they caught on to that, and then kind of shift it and then shoot it outwards to the world. And I think that would it also kind of goes back to it's interesting what you had said earlier about the not misinformation, but the not knowing what's true and what's not. Everything we have to like, is this real? And I think that's a big part of it too. It doesn't have to you don't have to believe the propaganda. You just have to not be able to trust whenever the news is real. And I think that's big because it's not always convincing. It's more just breaking down that trust in your information sources. So I thought I had another point on that one, but I might be blanking. So I'll come back to
That's great. And when you think of it, just let me know.
that.
And just to remind the audience too, yeah, if you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A box at any time. I think, this has been a great kind of primer as setting the scene as to what the scale of the problem is, and where we're going with it. I want to talk a little bit, shift the conversation a little bit about, what can we do about this? And Dian, I want to come back to you. And I know that you've done a lot of work on and a lot of research on fact checking. And so let's talk a little more about the role of fact checking in this kind of information environment. And so in the early days, for instance, of the war in Ukraine, fact checkers were overwhelmed with the amount of misinformation and disinformation that was being spread online. And I've talked about how fact checking at that time was nearly impossible just because of the volume and the geography and the lack of access to credible sources on the ground. And so we see this going on now with the war in the Middle East as well. And this is going to again be a new reality of what we're dealing with because of all of the pollution of misinformation and disinformation, and the sheer volume that can be generated in a very short amount of time and spread just as quickly. So in this kind of environment, what is the role of fact checking? Is fact checking still possible? And whose responsibility should it be?
So as you said, in this day and age, I believe fact checking and the role of professional journalism is ever more important than before. Now, what we are seeing is questionable, and the media literacy keeps emphasizing that we as a consumer and individual need to check and have our guard up, looking at whether there's a six fingers, but at the same time, technology has changed. So these media literacy skills have changed over time and very quickly. So putting too much burden on individual is not feasible anymore. Therefore, some professionals should step in, whether it's a journalist or a fact checker. As you said, we are bombarded with potentially fake information, and journalists are doing their best to filter and verify and get a double sources on that questionable information. But as you know, newsroom is shrinking, journalism businesses is getting weak. And with a smaller number of journalists, the amount of information they need to verify is overwhelming. Therefore, I believe there's no solution. It's $1 million question, but we need some shared responsibility and some standards where government can step in and help fact checker and journalists as a public media to protect public goods. This is not longer we can just trust platform companies and private companies to moderate and be responsible of their distribution. So as a bias, I'm a researcher in communication and journalism. I think journalist role is important.
And in your paper, you talk a little bit about a broader format of fact checking. And I wonder if you can just expound on that a little bit more of what could this look like in terms of a broader consortium, and how might we go about doing this?
So previously, when we think about disinformation and misinformation, we imagine political statements. And when fact checkers came in, verified this information, it has been quite controversial. From both sides, fact checkers are accused of being biased. But now with the AI, whether determining whether it's a fake or real, this becomes less political. It's all about credibility and authenticity. So I believe it's possible because this disinformation, misinformation crosses the border. It's everybody's business, and I know it's a challenging time. But once we have this shared credibility institute, which considers what is a standard method to go about to verify true and non-true information, and developing AI guardrails and policies, it benefits everyone involved. So rather than every time they dictate what is true or not, having a set of standards, how they go about verifying and having the policy to regulate misinformation generated by AI is possible, in my opinion.
It's always nice to have some hopeful commentary on some of these issues. Nathan, I want to come back to you. And the US and South Korea do have an MOU on working together to counter disinformation, most likely with sort of the China angle in mind. And how do you think they can enhance this cooperation, and what do you think they should be doing more of?
Thanks. So I think there are kind of two main kind of things that the United States and South Korea can do. First, just continue to deepen cooperation. The two governments have already started that under the previous administrations, and I think there's an opportunity to continue and deepen that. I will flag specifically, I think there's an opportunity for South Korea to conduct deeper engagement with Taiwan. If we talk about Chinese influence operations really globally, Taiwan is the number one recipient of Chinese malign activity. And so Taiwan has a lot of experience and expertise to share, both on how to detect Chinese activity and how to respond to Chinese activity. And so I think there's an opportunity for everybody, not just South Korea, but the United States, Japan, the Philippines, to learn from Taiwan because they have lots to share. So I think there's an opportunity to increase engagement with Taiwan as well. And then the second, for both countries is increased transparency, right? So to the best of my knowledge, South Korea has not released a kind of comprehensive official government report on foreign malign activity targeting South Korea. Could be looking at elections or just broader trends. I know there have been some uh, uh, occasional NIS reports on the topic, and that's some of the evidence we had talked about earlier. But I think regular, consistent government transparent reporting on these topics helps uh, identify the threats, provide more information, but also actually help baseline the consequences of, how effective is it? Trying to talk through that to make sure that folks aren't being sensational about some of these issues.
Thank you for that. And on Barney, on the North Korea side, um, in your paper, you talk a lot about needing a multi-layered approach to countering these trends. And what do you see as some of the key elements of that approach?
In regards to just North Korean operations or like specifically their AI or both?
Specifically, the AI
Mhm.
operations, the information side of stuff, start with that.
Okay.
If there,
I'll
implications
pivot.
for broader
Okay.
as well.
I think a lot of it, it really seems like the biggest part of this has been, in terms of mitigation, have always been, not have always been, but have been situational awareness. I feel like the more, it seems like we've been throwing a lot of money at technologies, and I think that's very important. Behavioral technologies for if they're already inside your environment. Technologies as far as like defending EDRs and kind of setting up your entire perimeter to block against these things. But it seems like throwing so much money at these things does help at scale. However, all it takes is one just trick of a person. The social engineering, there's no need to break into a bank and use all these high-speed weapons and all these things to get inside the bank to get the money or the intellectual property or to sway hearts and minds. When it's simple, I'm going to walk up to the bank teller and just ask them so politely and convince them to give me all the money. And that seems to be exactly what North Korea really relies on. So, I mean, you don't want to, how do you fix that problem? And I think a lot of that is just raising the bar and situational awareness. It's once you see bad, once you see how North Korea is operating, both from this is an IT worker trying to get into your environment using AI for the interviews. Hey, it really sure seems like he's reading off of a script. I know that because I know that's what I'm looking for. Versus a way too well crafted email coming from Jenny Town that says a certain thing, but the AI doesn't know how she speaks in certain call signs, and so they pick that up too. So it really is just the best way is also the cheapest, and that is situational awareness. Does this not pass it? There's a bit of human touch that always kind of goes on things that gives you that little ounce of hey, something's not right here, being able to verify, just knowing that they are after you and that some of the tactics being used, once you see it, it's hard to unsee. And so you start questioning every email you get, every correspondence, every video that might not seem the right way. Money can go a long ways, and we should be doing that, but we're still in the process of catching up with AI in terms of, hey, we're starting to put up little banners. This is a deep fake. Hey, this is something's being altered in the video. That will take time, but no matter what, we should increase the user base level of not everything that I see on my computer screen is real.
Well, actually, Gian, this brings me back to some of the discussion in your paper as well about social media literacy, and some of the training that you've been involved in and how it worked. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about sort of the how you've gone about doing this and what kinds of results you've seen.
So the best case study that I had so far in terms of curbing misinformation was during COVID-19, and with the government cooperation with a social media company, whether back then it was X, Facebook, and Google, they all collaborated and had a partnership with involving fact checking, and they moderated, they removed false information against medical misinformation. And that many studies show that it actually helped and remove this toxic and harmful information from the media ecosystem. But that was when, everybody got along, platform companies cooperated. But today we have a different dynamic. So we cannot just trust this best scenario situation every time. Things change, alignments break off. So we cannot just rely heavily on platform companies' intention and their will. Therefore, I argue the stable regulation, we need to think about regulatory framework where we balance between private profit and mindset with the public goods. And as for the individual media literacy, yes, again, it's very important to learn basic skills and check the sources. And when we see a AI summary, click the links and verify sources. But at the same time, consumers are bombarded. We have a fatigue. We cannot really force people to that verification every time as a consumer. So it's a huge dilemma.
As Barney was talking about, we see this a lot in our own communities here, because we do get bombarded with a lot of also phishing campaigns that just look so real these days. The North Koreans, especially in our space, have gotten really good at it and good at posing, what looks like real questions, what looks like real, research proposals. Sometimes they're good ideas too. So whatever ChatGPT they're using, it's working. So I want to turn to some of our audience questions. And of course, as you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Helen, I'm going to come to you first. There's a question from Young B. Lim that asks, how is Korea thinking about AI capability in terms of metrics or measurements, given the constellation of factors, flops, training data, et cetera? What are areas that Korea sees as concrete ways to measure capabilities and therefore leading towards policy discussions and implementation?
Yeah, when the law first came out, one of the debates was around the term high impact system and how are you going to define that? At the time that it came out, there's a similar language in the EU AI Act, and there's also a similar one now in the Taiwan version of it. And how they define those were based on the impacts that were created. So is there a danger to human life? Is it going to change the way this person or some group of people have access to loans, education, employment? But then at the end of 2025, before the law actually went into implementation and effect, there were some additional details that were released, and one of them was defining high performance AI models, which would be subject to particular safety requirements under the law as exceeding 10 to the power of 26 flops. flops, I think is in the actual question that she asked, or here she asked, but flops means floating power operations per second. And it's a very technical term for measuring the compute power and process of an AI model. That obviously having that term, a very technical term in this legislation, all of a sudden, I think created actually more confusion, and how this is going to actually be effective was in question. One, because other countries don't typically rely on such metrics and terms for defining which AI models are under certain safety requirements. Usually it's use case-based, industry-based, impact-based. This technical metric method is also potentially subject to not being able to scale quickly along with the way technology is evolving. Like even 2, 3 years ago, we probably were not thinking about what flops were, but 10 to the power of 26 floating operations per second may not mean a lot to most of us, but to a lot of AI experts who are technical, they can probably tell you that, oh, we might actually like be exceeding that really quickly, or like that's way too high, like we're not going to get there soon enough. It doesn't cover as much as many models as we think it covers. So there's a lot of concern regarding, will this South Korea AI Basic Act be able to keep up with the evolution of technology by pinning itself to such requirements and technical measurements?
Great. All right. So we have a number of questions from the audience that we do want to pull in here. And of course, for our panelists, flag me if you want to weigh in on these. So the first question is, I wonder how relevant the "is it real" question really is, particularly with regards to strategic campaigns versus, say, pushing out volume with repetition or certain association chains, such as, in other words, not trying to force a Pizzagate style event, but more target elite or general public opinion over time. And so what is the risks of "is it real," or is it good for us to be asking ourselves at all times, is it real? So kind of the pros and cons of the flooded information space, we have a lot. And what do we do about it? What really matters here? And I wonder, maybe Jian, we start with you, and others, of course, you can wait if you want to weigh in.
So this is actually a topic of one of my doctoral students' dissertation. He's working on what is the consequences of constant exposure to fake information, or you call it AI slop or synthetic media or deepfakes, depending on the situation. And he's looking at the downstream effect that is, even if it's a benign and entertainment-based fake AI content, eventually you might get to question, which is a legitimate question, because your brain and your cognitive thinking is all adjusted to that default setting. So that is, again, related to trust deficit and eroding public trust in all institutions. And at the same time, also psychological effect, where it goes to nihilism, that nothing matters, and it's a low dose of depression undertone. And at the same time, because humans have a cognitive confirmation bias, we already have those tendencies that we tend to believe what we want to believe. And this AI deepfake content makes this tendency even stronger. And therefore, it creates a political partisanship and polarization even more.
So I'll jump into that. I think it's also useful to put it in the context of like, what does the content we're looking at, do we need to think about it critically? Doesn't matter, right? So if you're watching football highlights, does it really matter if the AI has the Packers winning instead of the New York Giants, right? Like, maybe matters for the most diehard fans emotionally, but in terms of like consequences for the nation, not important, right? But if it is taking, you know, a presidential candidate and putting words in their mouth that are polarizing or untrue, misleading, a couple days before an election, to me that would seem very important, right? And so it's both, does the content matter for national security or freedom of speech? It's also, is it scale or is it very small, right? And so previously, malign actors had to make some trade-offs. Do they want scale or do they want really high quality content? AI goes a long way to solving that problem. You can have both, right? And so, if you think about, uh, the war in Iran right now, what if a malign actor, put out, fake images of atrocities or, U.S. service members who had passed away. Those types of incidents, you want to be able to identify, take those down, make sure that accurate information is getting out, right? And so I think it's really important to understand the context of those so that when there is accurate information coming out from relevant authorities, you can actually trust that information. It goes to Gion's point about, trying to address that trust deficit. But it doesn't mean that you can solve everything. Doesn't mean that you can, flag everything, but trying to understand the content that really matters and focusing your energy on that, I think is also important.
Hey, Jenny, can I add one line on that? A bit tangential to kind of what both of they had said, but more on the actual the campaign side of the house. Again, making the scale versus believability and how AI is kind of like blending both of those together to increase the success rates. I mean, what we've seen with the campaigns targeting like even the North Korea, like our community here, it was volume. What they lacked in sophistication, they made up it for in volume, and they were just spraying and praying, and they were having a high success rate. Now, with the implementation of AI and making those phishing emails look even better, it was only dumping gas on an already burning flame. And I mean, to prove that is it real thing. I mean, whenever I got the invitation for this event specifically, I called up Jenny because I thought it was a phishing attempt. So but yeah, it's a bit different from what you guys, but I thought it might be a little cherry on that.
Can I add one more thing as well, Jenny? I think it's a little bit of a different perspective, but the question about is it real? I think that asking that question is important despite the content. I know, Nathan, you gave this example of football versus national security concern, but I think especially in the Korean context where even before AI, there was so much misinformation with the Jirashi culture and it's just inundating the web. I think there is a huge tendency to allow the culture and the society to think that it's okay to have fake news, fake generated visuals products out there if we don't continue to question whether it's real or not. And I think being okay with having AI generated content, fake content, and not asking that question leads to events such as the 2024 like South Korean national porn emergency. And I think, yes, maybe we will never be able to catch up with the amount and the speed of fake content that's being created with fact checkers, but still having in our mind that like we need to know if this is real and we need to continue to signal that this type of content is not okay might be useful in shaping culture and society perceptions.
And certainly studies have also shown that people tend to be less critical of any content that they actually agree with. And so, this sort of cognitive bias, the echo chambers that it creates of, as long as I agree with it, I don't care if it's real, is also not a good approach and is really just fueling the polarization that we're seeing in many societies across the globe today. And it isn't just on social media itself. And, going back to the election context, there was, last January, or not last January, but in the last election, there was the incident in terms of, I think it was the New Hampshire primaries, where there were robocalls. So you had AI generated voice calls that were mimicking President Biden at the time, calling Democratic primary voters and telling them to save their vote until the election so that they wouldn't vote in the primaries. And so, it's not just about the videos that we see on social media itself, but, the ability to create content that does mimic voice, audio, images, and used in a variety of contexts where, again, it's really hard to tell on the phone, is this really the president calling me? Although you could probably tell he's unlikely to call you directly, but in that campaign period, those kinds of things do happen. And, if they're trying to actually influence voting behavior, this is a problem. And, asking, is it real, is an important thing, but the fact that you can't tell some of the times is also one of the problems that we're seeing with this this new capabilities. So I think there's lots more questions here. There's one to Nathan that agrees with the structural effects of leveling the lingua franca. Global conversation dynamics is potentially a dramatic effect. On the other hand, there should be the potential upside for these kind of LLMs assisting US allies for again, the cross-culture, the good sides of cross-cultural communication, and the ability to reduce coordination costs. And so since you've talked a little bit about the challenges, if you could also talk a little bit about the vice versa.
Oh, sure. Right. No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, so there's two aspects to it. I was talking about kind of the offensive uses of AI, but there's also the defensive uses, right? How can you leverage, these advanced capabilities to better detect or better help label or otherwise better inform folks as they're consuming content online? Absolutely. Uh, there's also the opportunity to use these tools to have better engagement across countries and across individual researchers, even folks like us on the call, to help increase awareness and drive some of these conversations, right? And so it's absolutely true that there are, two sides to the coin. Uh, my focus is on the threat side, but yes, there's absolutely some opportunities that everyone should be taking advantage of, with AI being so ubiquitous.
Right. All right. Uh, so I think the heart of the conversation that we're trying to have today, and of this research in general, and I want to pose this to all of our speakers to talk in their capacity, is this notion of, since the goals of disinformation, of course, are to erode trust in information sources, what trust building strategies do you recommend that could counter this? And especially thinking about, the idea that these strategies, how can they build cooperation across countries in order to deal with sort of the transnational aspects of the problem that we face today? And maybe, Barney, if I could start with you.
I'm sorry, I was reading the chat from D-Tech's question. I completely missed. Sorry about that.
So if the goal of disinformation is to erode trust in information sources, what are some trust building strategies that you would recommend to counter this, and especially areas in which we can build transnational cooperation on?
I think a lot of it, I mean, I'm almost kind of curious on what Jayun would think of this and too, with kind of her background on, because I saw that question too. For me personally, I'm going to just be nitpicking everything because I mean, even with the same thing, what we saw with the AI, with the summarizing the articles elements, We've even seen like companies right now where they're actually kind of doing an input manipulation. They're hiding text on in parts of the article that were actually going back. So using D-text as an example, like if we were to do this type of trick with an AI summary, we would actually bake stuff into the background of the text to kind of point back. So whenever you're doing like a business research tool or an AI summary, some of the stuff would point back to products maybe more aligned with us. And other companies we're seeing right now do that, where when the companies, whenever you do it, it's actually populating things that will point back to, hey, kind of SEO optimization, where you're kind of pointing back to your own products. Hey, you like this? You're summarizing this. These are some links that you can click on, pointing back to kind of the consumer angle of it. So it's not even always maliciously aligned. Sometimes it's business aligned. And unless you're going actually and checking the sources of things. Now, that's me in my kind of hillbilly brain where I'm always clicking. I don't believe anything I see online. I'm going to go and check the source. Is it from something that's, and a lot of times I'm using the media bias chart, which I think a lot of people know about, but it's a media bias chart, XY axis for the most accurate information versus the most politically aligned. You're trying to find something in that middle where it's high confidence and not politically aligned at all. And I'm always kind of going back, and anytime I see a source, I'll check it, cross-reference it to make sure that it's reputable. And then also just to make sure that whoever sent it to me isn't trying to alter it. If I'm clicking on the link and I'm actually going online, that's going to be a lot more easier to kind of like, okay, I can see this versus a PDF of something that could have been altered from a news source that you trust. And again, like you said, with that media bias, if it's something I don't want to read or something I don't like, doesn't mean I shouldn't be learning from it just because it didn't fit with my own political or any type of societal beliefs.
Great. Others, Gian?
I think the question is what is the strategy to depolarize and create a global collaboration? And which is $1 million question. And everybody has worked on this problem for many, many years, but we don't have a definite answer. I heard the solution from our previous conference the other day. Somebody mentioned universal watermark, which all these platform companies come together and we have a technological solution where we can verify this is an AI generated image or not and put the stamp there so that at least people know that this is AI generated or human generated. But again, the problem is how much collaboration we can bring everybody to the table. Different platforms have their own separate system, and we cross the borders, then it's another problem. So this is not an easy problem, and we have to keep pushing on this agenda. But again, I need to come back to this the institution we can trust. I believe the easiest one is what we already have, public media. They have to go through and filter trustworthy information. They can become a gatekeeper, not in a sense that gatekeeping political statements, but at least what is trustworthy, at least verified information, and put it out there on the market.
Helen, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of what Dr. Shin talked about at the conference as well about like social media literacy and working with people of older age and teaching them how to determine what is fake versus not. And in thinking about that, I think I mentioned this earlier, but the South Korean Chirashi environment is pretty inundated. I think a couple of years ago, I had done a piece on the National Assembly election that was coming up and kind of the survey results on where do people get their news in Korea. And it was an overwhelming percentage of people, I think it was like close to 70%, had said that their main source of news and information is now social media. And I'm pretty sure that in the United States, we're going to see something pretty similar. But just having been exposed to that space and knowing that space, I had found that particularly concerning. And there were also news around that time kind of calling out Kakao Talk, which is Korea's most popular and widely used messenger app, as the single largest source of disinformation, misinformation propagator. These people just forward links to each other without checking what they're getting. And thinking about those two pieces, it makes me think, going back to the original question, I think a critical piece of the trust building exercise or program that we're going to need to have is going to have to be about bringing the society up to speed about the trusted sources instead of going towards YouTube or Kakao Talk for your primary source of information.
That's a really good point. Nathan, do you want to weigh in?
No, I think all these are really good ideas. I think also any opportunity to kind of step beyond the online world and actually just re, return to like in-person interactions cuts through a lot of that, right? So Barney was talking about, well, somebody sends me something, but then I have to make sure if they're sending me an article or an email, is it really that article or do they, alter it from AP or Reuters, whoever, right? Well, if you go talk to somebody in person, obviously, I guess in some ways they can still lie to your face, but it helps really bridge that gap and you can talk to them and say, hey, that doesn't sound like a normal thing. Like, tell me more about that. I want to talk about it. So I think any time that you can actually bring people together, it just helps naturally break down barriers, partisanship, help build some more trust. So I think that would be my only addition.
Okay, great. Gian, there's a couple of questions here that talk about, are there common patterns across demographics that are more susceptible or less susceptible to the fake information that's out there?
So far, the research suggests that senior people are vulnerable to misinformation. There could be multiple factors. It could be cognitive decay, but not all seniors have this issue. It really fluctuates a lot. But those scammers and malicious actors target senior groups for taking money, financial reasons, or any other potential purposes. They often become a target. Therefore, there are many literacy programs popping up to tailor their programs towards this senior population. But at the same time, there's a few studies that says actually senior people are not statistically significantly vulnerable to this misinformation, disinformation. It's all about their cognitive skill. We call it need for cognition. There are some personal traits. Some people instantly question what they are hearing, what they are seeing. Some people just accept and tend to go with what they hear. So there's a personality trait that goes along. So again, we cannot have a universal answers to say which group is the most vulnerable, but it seems to be a pattern.
And certainly these days, it's also just harder to tell. The AI generated materials are much more convincing than they used to be. And so yeah, I think, Gian, in your report, you also talk about how even with human evaluators, there was a hard time, a very kind of low instance of being able to actually pick out what was AI generated and not. Barney, there was this question to you about the importance of relying on human touch, intuition. Is our increasing reliance on AI-supported screening tools for recruitment proposal review increasing vulnerability to malign use of AI, or does it provide opportunities to protect, or both? Is it in either or?
Yeah, thank you. This was the one I was reading earlier whenever I got distracted by that one. Sorry. I think there's a bit of a this one's kind of complex on how you go about it because like even what we saw in that one image that I attempted to bring up, you see they're pulling down so threat actors in North Korea, we already know that they're pulling down job postings that are being posted by XYZ company. They're then crafting their resume. And let's be real, a lot of these companies are using AI in their job description It's a full-on AI warfare. We have the companies using AI in their job descriptions on what they're looking for. We have threat actors taking that down using AI to then tailor their resume for it, and then to then send it out. And then you have these companies using the AI to then process the recruiting and process all this. So it's, at no point was there even a human, a lot of times even involved in some of these things outside of minimal direction being given. So it's interesting how you combat that in that angle because what we've seen on the IT worker side of the house and on some of the how not even on the IT worker, but even some of the crypto APTs, the hacking groups, they're the way they're taking it, it's almost like they're making these unicorn resumes so that they make sure that they stand out. Anytime you have, and people talk about these resumes and how they've done it all. These guys have been at the top of all these things, and so obviously they're going to float to the top of the pile in terms of hiring and recruitment. So, but the problem is that since all of them, so it's good because for them because it's actually raising and increasing the availability and that they can get into these environments. But it's also bad because all of them start to look the same. And so then this whole thing of I want to have this unicorn resume that stands out when you have so many people using the same technologies to build these unicorn resumes, then the actually human ones do tend to tick out and they're the outliers that sometimes you can point out in that situation. So it cuts both ways because it will increase their visibility, but then also it'll, whenever you make these errors in situations, sometimes, and I know with DTEX we have a couple of behavioral technologies where some things look too perfect. And sometimes that ends up being what gets you caught. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword for sure.
Right. All right. One of the suggestions here is, of course, if we had a disinfo suspicion emoji, what would that look like? And would it actually help? Then people can react with the emoji and let other people know their suspicions of it as well. I wonder, Gian, if you want to weigh
Yeah,
in on this.
I just read this comment and I really like this idea. I want to implement this to my research. For example, in order to detect what is disinfo, misinfo, I usually scrape the comments right below the video or the post and see whether they are discussing, is it fake, is it true? And instead of going through the comments, if there's an emoji where people can flag, I don't have to go through this additional work and then do my research. It'll make my job much easier. Thank you.
Is this like a community notes too thing? It feels like it's kind of an emoji community notes feature too.
Yeah, I suppose it could be. And if I think, one of the big problems was, with Twitter, they used to have some of the fact checking on Twitter. And then, of course, with the switchover, there's been more and more of these platforms that have taken away the fact checking in the community notes. And so I do think the community notes was an important element and an important tool that could be used. An emoji is easier, of course, and more people can do it. And then, have sort of that Reddit style, like scoring system of like, does this seem real? Does this not seem real? But you also then run into the opposite of, you can have a lot of people who don't think it's real when it is real. And how does that, again, still erode trust as well? And again, we've seen with a lot of the studies that have come out that if people agree with the message, they're more likely to believe it's real, even if it isn't real. And so you do have sort of that opposite effect that might happen as well.
Hey, Jenny, when you talk about the eroding trust, I think there's one thing that I don't think it's something that's happening, and I think it's in the future, but really with the trust and people, the over reliance on I think that we also need to factor in the data poisoning angle because we do see things like China using this. I just saw everyone just nod their head. So we're all this thing where we have the thing in back to June's point. I feel like I kind of want to go to your classes, June. I want to go to University of Florida. Um, it's like you kind of the older generation that might not be more technically savvy and the more susceptible to that, and but they're also not online enough for the threat surface to hit them as much. And then you have people in kind of the in-between era where we remember the rotary phone, but we also have a smartphone in our pocket right now, and we're kind of in between versus people right now, and it's a complete, they don't know life before them. They only know the internet. And it's interesting because I see a lot of over-reliance in reporting too. You see AI slop all over. I feel like a lot of these lower level news agencies, you can definitely tell. And it's going to be interesting to that eroding of the trust angle where if they're starting to inject malicious data or misinformation into the data model so that whenever you're querying the data, hey, give me this, tell me everything you know about Tiananmen Square, and if they've altered that, which is a very real thing that's happening, then if you're relying on AI, it might actually have been fed those malicious sources. And I think that's something that if we're not hitting already, I think that's going to be a big roadblock going forward.
At least previously with the social media data set, there were many bots. And when I do research on whether the public opinion is corrupted by this malicious actor, at least I could download, run the algorithm to detect what percent chance this post is coming from robot or malicious actor. But now with the AI, everything is under the hood. We don't know how this is assembled and who gets what. It's all personalized. So everything is behind the curtain. So it's almost impossible to figure out how much of it is manipulated data and it's not. So this adds more problem to the research community.
If I can add a kind of a policy angle, something that the AI policy experts and community talk about a lot is who has the burden of ensuring that the models are secure or creating good output. So even if we look at the South Korean AI law, like a lot of it's focused on AI operators, as they call it, like who is actually implementing the model or using it. But sometimes there's not a lot of policies that focus on AI model developers or AI model trainers even. So one of the other questions that I saw in the chat was about, along with the flops question, was there anything about like training data? And I hadn't touched on it because I haven't seen any policy that really talks about a model developer has to ensure that their training data is good and that there's some sort of enforcement or penalty that comes with it. And I think, I guess like the overarching comment here is that there really is not a clear division and targeting of who in the AI tech stack is under policies and regulation. And this is just another one of those that's kind of getting left out at the moment, but it's going to catch up pretty soon.
Even within the working groups, for instance, in the US-Korea working groups, they have one on emerging technologies, they have one on cybersecurity. I think, Gian, you and I have talked about this before in terms of the importance of having a common understanding or mutual understanding of values and standards and ethics in developing policies that would, end up regulating some of these things. And I think right now, those discussions are not happening. And in the policy community, in those working groups that are already working on the wide range of technologies that are being developed and trying to, look at how to catalyze innovation, that there should also be a part of that working group that also has those discussions about building a common and mutual understanding about the ethics of it. Going forward, knowing that all of these problems do exist, and especially as we see AI, generative AI especially run wild. I think there's one last question we'll take in terms of, oh, actually, Nathan, I had another question for you in terms of you talked about in the US-ROK working group that there is cooperation on countering disinformation, and that there's room for greater cooperation with Taiwan to learn from Taiwan's experiences in this. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Taiwan experience in terms of, how does that information operation differ from what you're seeing in South Korea, and what are some of the things that Taiwan has done to try and build that literacy and build that resilience?
Sure. Happy to talk about Taiwan. I think first thing to know is that there, a group of wonderful Taiwanese researchers who are really leading a lot of the work on specifically documenting and identifying, Chinese malign activity in Taiwan. Uh, you know, um, t- to the best that we know, Chinese activity, social media manipulation targeting Taiwan started in 2018. That's the first time the Taiwanese government talked about it. Uh, Seems likely it was Chinese military. It's hard to know exactly. I'd done some earlier work looking at how the Chinese military was actually kind of preparing for that operation because you know when elections are, so you have some lead time to kind of figure out what you want to do. But then it's been increasingly, challenge for Taiwan. We've done several random reports on the topic. And then, in 2024, there were fake audio recordings of presidential candidates in Taiwan that were leaked, and there was a very clear push. I think in some ways, the differences are it's much more obvious that China is doing it because it's so much more blatant. I think they worry less about attribution. They don't want it to be attributed, but it's such a high priority for them. And there's also lower consequences that they don't work. So it's much more blatant. It's also much more targeted at politics and elections. I think for South Korea, my sense is right now it's a concern, but it's not really the leading issue or, actual probably a high threat for the outcome of Korean elections. For Taiwan, this is a really big deal. It's something they push. I think also outside of the kind of online world, China also has a immense, human interpersonal enterprise under the United Front to align or match with these online activities. And so there is really, a long-standing, very comprehensive, holistic influence approach to Taiwan because that's just really where they focus their energy. For South Korea, some of these organizations do exist and serve similar purposes, but I would just argue that the weight of efforts is much lower than on Taiwan. And then I think lastly, the alliance dynamics are different because the U.S. has an alliance on the books with South Korea. The U.S. does not have an alliance on the books with Taiwan. It has a strong relationship and a strong defense relationship, but it's a very different, it's a different type of relationships. And so I think China's approach to the alliance versus the U.S.-Taiwan relationship probably is a little bit different. And I think lastly, for South Korea, there are other avenues for China to influence public opinion, are a little bit different than Taiwan. And so it really avails itself of all the tools it has at its disposal for any one case. I think also another interesting comparison that I didn't go down in the paper would be China's approach to disinformation or influence activities against South Korea versus activity against Japan, right? As another kind of important player in the region that China also wants to shape. And so I think there's also opportunities for South Korea to engage with Japan on some of these issues as both, come under greater threat from Chinese activities.
Well, and obviously, cooperation is the key here. None of these, what we've learned from especially information warfare during the current conflicts going on is that the information doesn't come from just one source. It doesn't target just one country. Everyone can have, every malign actor can have, compatriots that are helping in different areas and for different goals. There isn't any one goal to any disinformation or misinformation campaign, but it can have, broad-based effects across the board in terms of public opinion, shaping public opinion, shaping behaviors, shaping policies, or just raising suspicions about what's going on and trying to sow chaos and division. So, the more that we can build these cooperation into the mechanisms that already exist and really thinking about what are the new mechanisms that we need to really build transnational cooperation on these issues and build better media literacy and build better detection systems and more common standards, the more we'll be able to tackle this issue in the future and help at least try and mitigate some of the more negative effects of this reality. And with that, everyone, I want to thank you for joining us today. Thank our panelists for sharing their expertise with us, and thank the audience for sticking with us for these 90 minutes. And hope that there will be, again, one more report coming out in this series. It should come out next week, but you can find it online on the Stimson website, all four of the papers. And we do hope that our listeners will join us for future events as well. So thank you, everyone.